Muy buenos días, tengan todos y todos ustedes. Buenas tardes desde las otras partes del
Good
mundo.
morning to all the attendants, or good afternoon if you are on the other side of the world. Thank you very much for attending the World Democracy Summit. We'll give the word to Dr. Lorenzo Córdoba, President of the National Electoral Institute of Mexico. Thank you very much. Good day to everyone. Thank you to all those who are joining us in Mexico City and those who are joining remotely. Please be welcome to the National Electoral Institute, or as we call it in Mexico, the House of Democracy. I want to start by thanking every single person and organization, strategic partners that made possible this summit for electoral democracy and for the series of regional forums organized en route to this international event. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. This was an invitation from different institutions like INE and over 17 partners of the global network of international organizations, regional organizations specialized in electoral affairs and electoral institutes in the defense of electoral democracy. Just a couple decades ago, in the early 21st century, democracy was marching forward triumphantly in most of the world. Autocracies were walking backwards in all regions of the world. Today, global trends seem to be pointing in a very different direction. And indeed, today, more than ever, democracy is showing unequivocal signs of going backwards. Spaces are growing smaller. Citizen mistrust towards their representatives is growing, and their discontent with institutions and the misinformation and mistrust are increasing. They had a space in politics that was small, and now misinformation is coming from politics. Misinformation was used to have access to power, and today it is exercised from political power. And there's also an attack against freedom of speech and against the institutions in charge of organizing elections. Contemporary societies are becoming more complex, and many times it is hard to understand their full plurality, cultural richness, social differences, persistence of violence, disequality, corruption, and even climate threats. Democracy and elections are perfectible, and they are the most civilized route humanity has found to face and to solve challenges, including challenges we are facing today. And this can be seen through history, and this can be seen through the expression of the wishes of many people, like women and youth, that are taking the streets to demand their rights and demand better living conditions within a democracy. And for that reason, this summit, starting today, wants to promote the defense of values, behaviors, and institutions that allow democracy and elections to remain in time, to be perfected as an essential mechanism to solve the issues that we are facing and to build a better collective future, as the only mechanism humanity has found to access and to renew power without shedding any blood. Democracy can only last when practicing its essential principles, when respecting and accepting the results of an election, of all the results, and not just those that give you a win, and where during daily life people can exercise the values when they can practice the values of democracy itself. Democracy is preserved when elections and electoral integrity are understood as the only possible resource for a peaceful fight for democracy. Otherwise, democracy is lost. When elections are seen not as an opportunity to face ideas and programs, but as a means to attain office at whatever cost. When elections are used as the medium where everything can be done in order to attain a certain goal. Democracy can only grow when politics with passion and intensity is a medium to reach a consensus through persuasion of people who are free. And democracy perishes when it is used for the polarization, for harassment, for simplistic and anti-pluralistic segmentation of society, when it is used to practice intolerance and anti-democratic values par excellence. Democracy is possible when institutions in charge of electoral functions exercise their power autonomously from the other branches, and it is vulnerated when the institutions and people working in the institutions are object of disqualification, threats, and even physical attacks, when the institute is subject to budgetary affairs and law amendments that want to facilitate the influence of government and allow the institutional capture with political means. After 5 regional forums that took place in recent months that have presented challenges and perspectives of electoral democracy in Africa, Asia, Europe, the Arab region, and the Americas, today we are gathering here in this World Summit. At the same time, it is a point of arrival, but it is mostly a point of departure in order to develop a critical agenda to face the issues democracy is facing today and harassment electoral authorities are under in many parts of the world. The most promising strategy to safeguard democracy, electoral integrity, and institutions making them possible consists in articulating a wide coalition of people and organizations nationally and internationally to act collectively in the defense of democracy. And that is what this Electoral Democracy Summit is about, to recognize the dimension of the challenges we are facing as electoral authorizations and international organizations specialized in elections and in the promotion of democracy, and to foster a collective action that will help us face these challenges. The problems of democracy can only be solved with more and better democracy and within the democratic array itself, without taking any shortcuts that appear to be efficient, but that can suspend the rule of law. And that is our commitment in this summit. Best wishes for the start of this summit, and I want to express the commitment of INE to make this a starting point of a long-term international agenda to defend and to renew democracy and institutions that, hand in hand with citizenship, make elections possible throughout the world. I want to thank everyone for your attendance and for your enthusiasm and participation in this collective work, which is defending our democracies.
Muchas gracias al doctor Lorenzo Córdoba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lorenzo Córdoba. Now I will introduce the opening with Elizabeth Specher, Joint Secretary General for the Consolidation of Peace from the United Nations. Ms. Specher has over 35 years of experience in international and political affairs. She has participated in different peace missions, prevention of conflict, mediation, and she is widely experienced in the promotion of electoral democracy throughout the world. Dr. Specher, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well. Very good. Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días, buenas tardes, excellencies, distinguished guests. It's an honor to be able to join you today on behalf of the United Nations at this global summit for electoral democracy. Multilateralism and global debate represent the heart of the United Nations. I therefore want to commend the National Electoral Institute of Mexico and the other organizers for their vision in bringing us together today on this topic. And I salute all participants of this event today, the electoral administrators, government officials, members of civil society, and international democracy supporters, all of you who work towards credible and peaceful elections. In the experience of the UN, most elections are conducted with integrity. And people around the world continue to firmly believe in the universal value of democracy and of elections. They take pride in their right to choose their leaders and to participate in decisions that affect them. But the challenges, as we have just heard, are painfully clear. We see deep polarization and populism taking hold in many parts of the world. Voter apathy, an assault on facts through misinformation, a continuation of deeply entrenched racial, gender, and other inequities, and a growing refusal to accept electoral results, which sometimes ends in violence. All of this can poison social cohesion. Electoral management bodies, as well as the judiciary, play important roles in countering these damaging effects and in protecting public trust in democratic institutions. But we also find that citizens' confidence is determined by factors that go beyond the technical or even legal quality of the electoral process itself. Compliance with international obligations or an effective performance by electoral management bodies are not always sufficient. Confidence is also shaped by the broader political and economic context. And so it is actually political leaders from both government and opposition parties who bear the overriding responsibility for successful elections. It is they who set the tone for their supporters. It is they who serve as models in engaging in public discourse and as promoters or not of peaceful political contests. Democracy is, of course, about much more than a sound election. People need to see results in their everyday lives, or they'll lose faith in their governments and in the institutions, and they will lose hope for the future. And people themselves need to have and use the political space to engage actively in their democracies and beyond just election day itself. So I would like to end my remarks with a quote from our UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Democracy depends on people being seen, heard, and understood. They need leaders who summon the best in us by honoring human dignity and drawing on the talents, ideas, and energies of every person to safeguard the principles of equality, participation, and solidarity. Now is the time to reaffirm shared values and strengthen democratic resilience, unquote. As world leaders gather today and for the rest of the week in United Nations headquarters to tackle the many global challenges that we're facing, let us use this opportunity to remind them of the need to continue to uphold and to strengthen our cherished and shared democratic values and institutions. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la doctora Elizabeth Espejar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth Specher, for your inaugural intervention on the first day of the Global Summit for Electoral Democracy. We have electoral authorities and international organizations from Europe, Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Arab region are here today. We should continue with our agenda. The next panel will be moderated by Electoral Counselor Norma de la Cruz.
Muy buenos días, tengan
Good
todas
morning,
todos ustedes que nos acompañan
everyone.
de los
Thank you very much
diferentes
for
países que están
joining us
que
from your
nos están
respective
acompañando en este
countries.
evento. Damos la cordial bienvenida a esta cumbre
We
global de la
welcome you to
democracia
the Global
electoral,
Summit
que
of
hoy estamos
Electoral
honrados de
Democracy.
contar con la
It is an
participación
honor
de un
to
destacado
have the
intelectual de la
participation
Universidad
of a
de
very
Stanford.
important
Sus
person from
credenciales
Stanford
académicas han
University.
permeado
His
en los 5
academic credentials
continentes
have permeated the
sus
5
investigaciones
continents.
y reflexiones
With his
sobre la
research
democracia
and his
liberal.
reflections
El
on liberal
profesor Larry
democracy,
Diamond ha
Professor Larry
investigado en
Diamond
este espacio de
has
la
done
democracia
wide
durante
research
más
on
de 40
democracy for
años
over
de manera
40 years,
prolífica y
and
también
he
ha
has been a very
compartido su
prolific
trabajo
researcher.
intelectual con
He has shared
autores
his
como Steven
intellectual work
Levinsky,
with
Juan
authors like Stephen
Linkoff,
Levinsky,
Plattner y Simon
Plattner, and
Martin,
Simon
que
Martin.
este último también participó en uno
The
de los
last
foros
one
organizados
participated
por
in
INE
one of
de
the
México.
forums
En
organized
nombre de
by
los socios
INE
que
in
promovemos
Mexico.
la
On
Cumbre
behalf of the
Global de la
partners
Democracia
promoting
Electoral
the
y
Global Summit of
particular del
Electoral
INE de
Democracy,
México,
and
expresamos
specifically
nuestro
Mexico's
agradecimiento por su
INE, we want to
participación en
thank you
nuestros
very much
eventos
for your
internacionales.
participation in
Esta cumbre
international
global
events.
cierra el
This
ciclo de 5
summit
foros
closes
regionales
the
que se
series of
llevaron a
5
cabo
regional
desde junio
forums
pasado.
that started on last June.
Eh, también en el trabajo intelectual que el profesor Diamond
Professor Diamond has
agarró
a
cuenta del
lot of
proceso de
work
democratización
regarding
iniciado en la
the
década
process of
de los 70 y
democratization
hasta
that
finales
started
del
in the
siglo XX.
70s to the
Después de
end
este
of the
proceso
20th
en
century.
ascenso de la
After
democracia
this
liberal y
process of
considerando la crisis
ascension of liberal democracy and
2008,
considering the
hoy la
economic
democracia
crisis of
parece tener
2008,
serios problemas,
democracy
por
seems
lo
to
que el
be in
profesor
serious trouble.
Diamond ha
Therefore,
planteado la
Professor
necesidad
Diamond
de
has expressed
intervenir para
the
mejorar la
need to
gobernanza en los
improve
estados
governance
democráticos.
in
De no ser
democratic
así,
states.
la gente
Otherwise,
recurrirá a
people
alternativas
will
autoritarias.
look
En
for
los últimos
authoritative
trabajos del
alternatives.
profesor
The
Diamond
last
en
works by
el
Professor
2019
Diamond in
también nos habló de
2019
las
talk
debilidades de la
about the
democracia, pero
weaknesses of
también
democracy
de los posibles
and
cursos
the
de acción
possible
para
courses of action
fortalecerla.
to
Profesor Diamond
strengthen
esta mañana
democracy.
nos hablará
Professor
de estos
Diamond
temas
will
y de
talk
las
about these
lecciones
topics
aprendidas en
and
la
lessons
era
learned
pospandémica que
in the
transformó las formas de
post-pandemic,
organizar no
which
solo procesos
transformed
electorales, sino
the
de
way in
organización
which our
social.
electoral
También nos
processes and
ayudará a
society are
reflexionar
organized. He will
sobre qué está
also talk
pasando
about
hoy con
what's
nuestra
going on
democracia y
today
tiene
with
salida
democracies.
o es que el
Is
siglo
there
XXI
an
tendrá un
exit,
reto
or
hacia
will the
el
21st
autoritarismo
century will
electoral,
mean the return to
nuevos
electoral
regímenes
authoritative
menos
regimes and
democráticos?
less democratic
Bueno,
regimes?
estas y otras preguntas nos estará
So
compartiendo el
Professor Diamond
profesor
is going
Diamond.
to talk about
Bienvenido.
this and other topics.
Adelante, por favor.
Professor Diamond, thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Councillor De La Cruz, for your very warm and generous introduction. And thank you to all the leadership and staff of INE for organizing the series of meetings and calling very focused and urgent attention to the challenges that electoral democracy and electoral administration face in the 21st century. I want to begin by making 2 points. The first point is the obvious one that all of you at INE and all of the people in this conference who have worked to administer professional, transparent, high quality, credible, free and fair elections understand that the core bedrock and irreducible condition of a sustainable electoral democracy is efficient, competent, fair, neutral electoral administration. Nothing has changed in that regard, and that has only become more urgently apparent as we've seen new, sophisticated, in some ways shocking for the United States, and growing challenges to the administration of elections. I wish we in the United States could get to the point that you're at in Mexico, where we could have, at least at the level of the 50 states, a neutral and independent electoral administration administering elections, rather than what we have as an anachronism and a very worrisome point of vulnerability in the United States, which is in many of the US states, the majority having partisan and elected officials a title called Secretary of State be the chief electoral officer. But anyway, I think that's well understood by all of us. The second point is that every system of electoral administration does its work in a social and political context, which the previous two speakers have noted is under threat and challenge now due to polarization, growing distrust of institutions in general, including electoral institutions, efforts from outside our countries and from enemies of democracy inside our countries to spread disinformation about elections. And so it's not enough for us to simply build up the infrastructure of free, fair, competent, and credible electoral administration. We have to worry about the broader context. And so we can go from the most outer rung of context and kind of work our way in. And at the outer rung, it's important to note that we have faced a lot of challenges, new challenges and old challenges, to the quality of democracy and to public faith in democracy that result from globalization and its impact in displacing jobs in many countries and making people more economically insecure, even as it creates jobs in new ways. And the relentless growth of income and wealth inequality in most countries around the world, actually, including the United States, the advanced industrial democracies, and of course, the continuing very high levels of income and wealth inequality in Latin America. Secondly, I think a new form of challenge for democratic institutions and their ability to command public faith and loyalty has been the rise of social media, with its proclivity to elevate and privilege disinformation, conspiracy theorizing, outright falsehoods, outrageous lies, and anything else that will fixate people's attention on the social media platforms, because the social media companies know that the more time that the users spend on their platforms, the more ads they sell and the more data they collect, and therefore the more profitable their operations become. So we have to find ways to address, through very careful, creative, I hope multilateral across the democracies, regulatory efforts to require greater transparency from the social media companies, and engage them, press them, and induce them to do more to reduce and remove demonstrated falsehoods, foreign and domestic disinformation, and the kinds of social media interventions that have no other purpose than to generate, through outrageous lies and distortions, anger, alienation, defection from faith in democracy, certainly political polarization, and so on. I want to say next that we know who benefits from political polarization, cynicism, and loss of confidence in democratic institutions. It's both the authoritarian adversaries of democracy around the world, and I will name the two most prominent ones, Russia and China, but also the populist and illiberal political forces within countries that are trying to play on fears, prejudices, and anxieties about democracy to ride to power and retain power. And so we have the relatively new phenomenon that we've seen in the United States, unfortunately, with an incumbent president and before that a presidential candidate, possibly a presidential candidate again, and the incumbent president in Brazil and many others, a cynical, dedicated, and democratically disloyal effort to fan cynicism about and lack of confidence in electoral administration as a way of trying to ride to power, retain power, or develop some means of staying in power if in fact they lose elections. We have an enormous amount of work to do to transcend these anti-democratic strategies and promote broad public commitment to the electoral process and to the outcome of elections, particularly if someone wants to challenge them, then, once the proper and legitimate procedures for electoral challenge are resolved, that should be the end of it. I might add, what some of you may know, that we have a particular vulnerability in the United States because of uncertainty about the procedures for resolving disputes over the election of our president in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an undemocratic and anachronistic institution. I wish we could get rid of it, but it's in our Constitution, which is very difficult to amend. The Congress is now working in the United States on something called the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022, which would fix some of the loopholes that make it easier to challenge presidential election outcomes. There's bipartisan support for this in the United States Senate, and we very much hope it will pass before the end of this year. Some of us are also trying to campaign in the United States for reforms that would, frankly, catch up with Mexico and South Africa and Taiwan and other democratic systems to implement, as I said before, more neutral and professional consummate authorities for administering elections and setting the policies for electoral administration. In the few minutes I have left, I want to address another issue that surrounds the process of elections and electoral administration. And that is the problem of severe political polarization, which of course interacts with the toxicity, cynicism, and disinformation on social media, but is driven by many other factors as well, including the rise of new generations that are more economically insecure, and that didn't grow up in an era of struggle for democracy, and so may not be as well socialized into the values and norms of democracy. And I think that we all, as individuals, civil society leaders, and public officials committed to the integrity and continuity of free and fair elections, have to worry about the psychological and normative dimensions of the atmosphere around the conduct of elections and the broader attitudes of the public toward the democratic process. This, I think, must require two additional efforts beyond simply informing people about how elections will be run. One is a broader effort at civic education, at democracy education, which I must say with regret has fallen into a deteriorated state in the United States, but I also think in many other democracies around the world. And I think it is urgently important, particularly in the era of disinformation and social media saturation, that we work through the school system to develop curricula that will socialize our young people all over again to the fundamental norms and values of democracy, the importance of political choice and competition, the importance of political participation and engagement, the importance of questioning information that you receive and being skeptical and thoughtful consumers of information, some tools in the new era to question what we receive in our social media feeds and be more proactive in trying to evaluate them. And of course, always tolerance and mutual respect for different points of view. Some of these are not natural norms, particularly the latter one, especially in an era when social media is, again, designed to stimulate our emotions and drive us deeper and deeper into social media bubbles. And so we have a lot of work to do in our schools, our communities, our faith networks, and other gatherings to try and promote these understandings and core values of democracy beyond just electoral administration. Finally, we need to do more to bridge our political divides and promote mutual respect and tolerance between competing political parties and partisans of different parties. We need to lower the temperature of politics so that competing political partisans will accept and understand that if they lose an election, it's not the end of the world, that all the different parties are committed to the minimum new rules, norms, and restraints of democracy. If you lose an election, there's always the next election when you can come back to power. We have been experimenting for some time now at our deliberative democracy lab at Stanford.edu. You can go to CDD, Center for Deliberative Democracy, cdd.stanford.edu, and learn more about our work with deliberative polls to try and promote more objective and balanced understanding of the political issues, and to try and reduce toxic, ill-informed, emotionally destructive partisan polarization. And I think anything we can do in our organizations and faith communities and social networks to promote reduce partisan polarization and tolerance for different points of view will be a positive for free and fair elections. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Professor Diamond.
Thank you very much, Dr. Larry Diamond. Really interesting reflections, so many topics to reflect, not just the role of us. As you said, the USA also will be good to have an electoral national institute like ours, and we need to learn a lot also from you and how the social media has been having such a noxious effect in the deconstruction of democracy and the need to have a global intersectional solution, because this impacts all countries. And also our role, the need to have national strategies at a state level of civil democratic education that must include each and every one of the issues dealing with electoral education formally and informally, and as a daily life issue. That is why we need to construct and participate with all institutions. I have 3 questions for you, Professor Diamond, one in English
populist regime proving to be so effective to win elections and to maintain these regimes in power. La primera. ¿Cuál es su opinión respecto a la ausencia
In
de
regard to the absence of international bodies in the USA and Europe to really take care and maintain democracies at a world level? And the last question, credibility crisis on democracies that we're living today, that began as 2010. Is it just an issue that we're living right now, or we're in the hands of authoritarianism that could be so effective as today? If you're so kind as to answer, Dr. Diamond.
Right. Well, if I understood, I didn't quite, it came in late to the first question, so I didn't quite hear it. On the second question, if I understood it, the absence of authoritative international electoral bodies or observation or so on. I mean, Europe and the United States do have institutions that try and reach across boundaries to assist with free and fair elections and help monitor elections. And if the implication of the question is maybe that should go in reverse and have elections monitored in the United States, for example, too, of course, I'd be all for that. I think we all should be transparent and open to one another. But if there was another implication of that question, I'd be happy to hear it. With respect to the third question, I think that the point of it was to ask why since 2010, and it's really been since about 2006, we've had so much slippage of democracy. Why has the momentum moved backwards? And I would go back to what I was saying before, that there are some domestic drivers and there are some international drivers. The domestic drivers have to do with social change, growing economic inequality and unfairness, unfulfilled expectations for government performance in terms of economic improvement and jobs and so on. We live in an era, independent of social media, of greater media saturation, more cable television stations, more media competition. So in one sense, and it's a good sense, there's more public exposure of political wrongdoing and of corruption. But on the other hand, that also can breed political cynicism and pave the way for populists to say that they're going to come in and clean everything up. And of course, what happens when populists come in is that they turn out to be even more abusive and corrupt than their predecessors. I think also we can't underestimate the damage that's been done by the rise of authoritarian regimes that claim to be superior in their models and that have been waging a propaganda war against democracy and also trying to infiltrate malign influence activity. We just had a revelation recently that Russia in the last decade or so has pumped something like $300 million into the funding of right-wing, anti-democratic and illiberal parties and candidates in elections around the world.
Muchas gracias. Profesor, tenemos
Professor Diamond, we have more questions that we're going to send you. Because of time issues, we need to continue with our agenda. Professor Larry Diamond, on behalf of the counselors of the INE, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you so much being so kind as to sharing your reflections with us in this summit. And thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us, your reflections with us, and they will be part of this great event. And it was a pleasure and honor to share this podium with you, and we will continue forward. Thank you very much to all participants who are in this session, and we will conclude this first session of democratic principles and values in the post-pandemic era, and we will continue in this event. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.
Just a 5 minutes break so we can continue with our next panel on education for democracy, permanent work. Thank you.
La democracia nos importa a las y los mexicanos.
Porque permite que nuestras voces sean escuchadas.
Porque permite que nuestras grandes ideas puedan construir un mejor futuro. Durante mucho tiempo soñamos con democracia. Pero hoy que estamos despiertos y unidos, logramos que todas las voces cuenten. Unidas y unidos vivimos en una democracia sin muros que nos dividan. Unidas.
Luchamos por nuestros derechos.
Y unidos hemos conseguido tener elecciones libres y auténticas. Por eso inspiramos al mundo para proteger la democracia, los derechos y nuestras libertades, porque ese es el camino de la paz. México es sede de la Cumbre Global de la Democracia Electoral, porque en el mundo y en México, nuestro INE nos une.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, tengan todos ustedes. Continuamos con el programa de la Cumbre de la
We will
Democracia
continue
Electoral en
with
este primer día.
the Summit on Electoral Democracy. We will open our first panel, Education for Democracy, a permanent work. Today, we have the presence of our moderator, Teres Pierce Lanella, head of electoral processes at IDEA International, and she's widely experienced in the electoral affairs. She works in publications and works regarding electoral management training. She has participated in different missions in Africa, Europe, and Asia, and she has also worked for different international organizations, including the Organization of Security and Cooperation of Europe, the European Union, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and Gapel Center. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Manuel, and thanks all
Muchas
of
gracias.
you who are here. It is such an honor to be your moderator for this session today, and the topic is such an important one. The subheading that Manuel suggested was a permanent work, that this is something that's ongoing. And if we see electoral education or democracy education as a continuum, then perhaps we can think back at about 30 years ago, when the electoral management bodies, the political leaders, and the civil society organizations of Southern Africa in particular really showed leadership in how to engage and how to animate and excite citizens in their own democracy. And at that time, they argued and they showed that EMBs need to do more than tell citizens how and when to vote. They said that they needed to motivate and create enthusiasm and explain why voting matters and how the systems work. And those pioneers of electoral education, they showed us that we needed to use compelling methods and cooperate in new ways. For example, with religious and civic educations with great reach, and with cultural groups, with dance groups and theater groups, and using methods like cartoons and plain language. And the goal of all of this was to reach the hearts and the minds of even the most traditionally disempowered citizens with the message that democracy was also for them and that their vote counts, your vote counts. 30 years later, we as a practice community are in a profoundly different situation. And one example is the obvious one for anyone who has teenage kids, but how do we work? What methods are we using? Who are we cooperating with to meet a new generation of voters who are largely on their telephones? But in the spirit of this summit, what we'll focus on today is the messaging and the imperative of democracy education or electoral education, civic education. And as we heard in the introductory speeches, with electoral processes under attack and election officials working under really extreme pressures, almost inhuman conditions at times, there can be a natural temptation to hide or retreat. But it's exactly when you're under attack that you need to move forwards and outwards with the strongest possible public communication strategy and a renewed building of alliances in defense of electoral integrity and electoral independence. And that is why electoral education is back at center stage on the agenda. And I think that's why it's featured as the first session of this important summit. So in this session, we'll be hearing from the front lines of this work of reimagining what electoral education, what democracy education can and must look like. And we'll do it through three extraordinary people, through Joseph Thompson, or Jose, who is the head of CAPEL, through Matthias Humke of IFES Mali, and Anne Ravel from Transparencia Electoral. And we'll begin with you, Joseph. The floor is yours, Jose.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to each one of you. It is a pleasure to be present in this summit. This is particularly relevant after joining the regional meetings, after having parameter for comparison, and to hear all the emphasis that is put on rescuing democracy and how that starts with electoral democracy. And from CAPEL, which is part of the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights, I want to thank INE for inviting us to join this group of organizations to support this process. Some reflections on educational matters that, well, we did not talk about this, but you will see that coincidentally, this is a continuation of what we heard a few minutes ago with Professor Diamond. Let's begin with something. It may seem obvious, but it has important implications. With no legitimacy of origin and electoral democracy, there is no democracy, period. But even if you have a certain electoral democracy, you don't have enough for a democracy as such. A government must have the legitimacy respecting the democratic principles and rights of people, and society must positively value the coexistence based on reciprocal respect, dialogue, and tolerance, which are the basis of a solid and sound democracy. Number two, education. Some kind of education for democracy must involve different actors, the government, the Department of Education, and other agencies and social institutions, the media, civil society, and today, as Therese just said, we must also use social media. We need new mechanisms that will reach specific populations. And now let's all together think about this. We are involved with electoral organizations in Latin America and the Americas in general. And we are always thinking, where can electoral organizations contribute to education? Well, they evidently contribute with the practice of electoral democracy by creating the necessary conditions for fair, sound elections followed by all those adjectives making them valid and authentic. But in our region, electoral organizations are autonomous, they are specialized, and they are permanent. And I want to emphasize these words. And that is what turns them into organizations for democracy, bodies for democracy, not just for elections. And this is the understanding of these organizations in most of Latin America. They have therefore explored the need to undertake educational activities. And I am not going to list all of them, but in Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, Paraguay, they all have the mandate for education in their electoral institutes, and some of them have even created educational institutions that are relatively functional autonomous, like in Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, or the Dominican Republic. Just a few. They have schools, they have institutes that develop curricula and try to link their activities with the development of national curricula. And this leads to forums, discussions, and even the development of doctrine. Evidently, we are living through a period of steps being taken back in many democracies. If you just go to the social media and you read comments, if you read digital newspapers, it is clear the abundance of intolerance, of attacks to each other, to the institutions, and even attacks to some essential values of democracy. Electoral bodies can and must have an important role in calling for working together so that education for democracy is a permanent task in response to the question in the title of our panel. And this education should not just focus on content, but in developing values and skills with respect to democratic values, principles, and practices. Some of us have been warning about this deterioration for a decade, deterioration of democratic values in the world. And evidently, this process is not stopping, but is extending. And it is deeply rooted in some countries, which frankly are regressing and can no longer be qualified as democracies. We were not naive, but we didn't think this process would accelerate in such a way. And for that reason, we must give value and importance to education, not just educating for one electoral process or educating for one specific situation, but education that considers the essence of democracy and explains how a democratic society is a society certainly more capable of solving any issues compared to authoritative regimes that are using propaganda claiming to be more efficient. The international reality is showing there is a need for permanently working on these issues. And it says that we must not be overconfident regardless of how sound institutions and principles appear or how sound the functioning of our states appears to be. No one can say that is fully free from any danger of going backwards. Therefore, let us all invest in education, in developing values, in engaging the youth at school, from school, engage them in political discussions, engage them in the development of proposals. And there, at least, we feel that we are still making our best efforts in order to preserve democracy. And we expect democracy can be recovered in those places where it has been lost already. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that powerful and thoughtful intervention. And I'm wondering, Matthias, if this resonates with you and what you're seeing on the ground with your work from Mali and before that, your work with Osiwa and so forth. Are you seeing the same patterns, trends, and do you have the same thoughts moving forward?
Yes, so what I will do is to share with you how we have seen the work on elections and citizens education moved from like about 1990s when we started with this third wave of democratization to today. For instance, as you know, we started, most of our countries in Africa were under authoritarian regimes with presidents who were in office for life. So the first thing at the beginning, the education was about at least letting people know how to go through the process of voting, how to vote. And in addition to that, because in Africa, our past and the relationship that we had with some of the Western countries, in addition to telling people how to vote, for instance, there are other issues. For instance, a question like, where should a president, leave office through elections? Because what we are used to is the president is there and he's there for life. So why do we want to change him? Another question is democracy, elections, and all of that fit for Africa? Are we not, bringing from outside something that will not work in our environment? So the education at that time was at the same time that we were talking about how to vote, we were also trying to show people why it was necessary and how it's not something that is not fit for our environment, etc. At the next stage, we realized that in addition to the how to vote, we now need to talk about why we are voting. So at that stage, the education now had to do with what we call the issue-based campaigning, how to force politicians, for instance, and candidates to come out with some concrete promises to voters, etc. So we had like initiative to force them to do that, but at the same time, we provide also work also to develop a mechanism, a kind of post-election mechanism. We call one of them presimators, for instance. These are promise trackers that we developed in almost all the countries that I know in West Africa. I know West Africa the most. For instance, we have these promise trackers where you try to follow the elected president and see how he is implementing the promises that he made during campaign time, etc. Along the way, we also realized that, how can I say, without going beyond, we noticed that citizens were now being disaggregated. You have the citizens, the voters disaggregated by age, disaggregated by the channel through which they get information. So that forced us now to tailor the strategy that I use to say, for instance, when you want to reach people not working, for instance, you want to reach people who are in villages, you want to use the youth, you want to reach professionals. We know now that we have like several media through which they get their information. So the strategic education strategy now also is taking into account how to target specific groups and see how to reach them. And we use several means for that. We even used in our environment here, for instance, singers, like famous singers. We use like movies. We went to Nigeria with Nollywood and see how we can use movies, etc. So we try now to adapt to the fact that the voters are being disaggregated through following several parameters. And the last thing that we are seeing today is, for instance, the fact that we are having social media and internet. And when you add this to the whole thing now, whatever education that we want to do, we now need to take into account the fact that social media is becoming one of the most effective ways of reaching voters, especially when we know that in Africa, majority of voters are youth. And the youth are the people that you find the most on social media, etc. So for me, that is, for instance, how you see progressively that we need to continue adapting the strategies to do education, the need of education, because when you look at the region as well, you see that the challenges that democracy is facing are evolving as well. So while on the election front, we need to adapt, on democracy front in general also, you see as we are progressing, that we are resolving some of our problems, but new problems are coming. For instance, at the beginning, we thought, for instance, that when you are coming from authoritarian government regimes, you make creation of political parties very easy. You make participation to elections very easy, creation of CSOs easy, but we found ourselves 10 years later that we had like 200 political parties. You have for presidential election 100 candidates. So we had other problems that we need to deal with. And dealing with this problem now, we see the new solutions that we bring about because of the problem of endogeneity of democracy. People who are finding the solution have also interest in the solutions, etc. You see that these new solutions also bring about their own problems. So it seems like democracy eventually is like you are solving the problems, and because you solve some of the problems, you create new problems, and you need to continue like thinking about ways of keeping citizens, political actors, everybody up to date on how to make sure that the system continue to function. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that trajectory. And as we move to you, Anne, you know, in the trajectory that Matthias just went through, and also the intervention before when Jose was telling us about just the the institutions that were created to protect democracy. I think the US has gone in a really, there was a bit of a disconnect between those global conversations and the United States, but that's really seems to be changing right now. And the fact that we're all here in the same session, I think speaks to that those conversations are getting closer together globally, the US and the global conversation. But yeah, really looking forward to hearing your intervention, especially with your experiences, both from inside government and then from academia and also civil society. Please go ahead, Anne.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being here. Recently, civil society has had a completely different role when it relates to electoral processes. And there's many organizations in civil society that specialize in national election monitoring. Transparencia Electoral, who I work with, has been involved in both national and international observations because election observation, as we know, is a really important part of the democratic processes in Latin America. They're directly related to principles of accountability and transparency that have to inform the work of all election management bodies. They also have become, these civil society organizations, a vital part of national and regional discussions about what does constitute a free and fair election and about what standards and what education needs to occur for an election to be considered democratic. And civil society has become more and more involved in these activities and often deployed more observation missions comprised of former election officials, academics who study the quality of democracy in elections, and practitioners who observe to learn about and recommend new policies to guarantee inclusion, transparency, and to improve the integrity of elections. As has been said numerous times before, including by Professor Diamond, in today's climate of democratic backsliding, it is more important than ever that efforts to uphold and defend democracy are diversified. Civil society organizations can provide a unique perspective. And of course, education has a pivotal role in the success of democracy and should prepare the four most important actors in our elections: political parties, education, election administrative bodies, civil society organizations, and citizens. Not only do election officials need to be prepared for all aspects of election administration or election monitors to assess all stages of the electoral process, but as has been already said quite clearly, citizens have to be able to identify what are official and credible sources, and also should understand their own responsibility to protect democracy. And INE has done an amazing job in that arena to rebut and surface disinformation quickly so that people can be more understanding of the truth. This is a task that is shared both with civil society organizations and election management bodies, and in promoting civic engagement, supporting democratic governance, and also being involved in civics education. Given the backsliding, educational campaigns need to be reformed to address all the challenges that democracy is facing, including debunking disinformation, which is important, but to educate citizens about how to identify the information that's false and to try to stifle the disinformation campaigns from getting traction. Transparencia Electoral has had numerous programs that they've organized to promote the discussion of key aspects of the electoral process and to train election officials. Recently did something like that in Salamanca, Spain. But they have also become a key regional actor in election observations, in particular with the deployment of first ever subnational election observation missions by an international civil society organization for the purpose of education in local groups, local entities. And these missions took place in the local elections in the state of Durango, Mexico in 2022, and also in a mayoral local election in Petrolandia, Brazil in 2021. And the Transparencia Electoral received an honor from the Global Network of Electoral Justice for the work in the Brazilian election. And I want to talk about that a little bit because it deals with the issues that we're discussing right now. In Brazil, we worked with the electoral judges who had gone to, in this small town in Petrolandia, to the elementary schools all the way to the high schools to talk about the upcoming election, to talk about the issues, and all the children voted. And they voted on paper for which of the candidates they wanted. And ultimately, the day before the election in Petrolandia, the children came, and there were auditors from a local a nearby county, and the children voted on the machines, using the election machines, using their papers, but then using the machines. And the auditors looked at the comparisons, audited them, and they found the consistency between what the machines did and what the children had to be 100% accurate, 100% accurate. And this was covered by news sources throughout Brazil, mostly in Brasilia and Rio de Janeiro. And as a result of that, and of course, you know that Bolsonaro today and previously in that election as well has said that the voting machines were not accurate, they were fraudulent, and that the elections were going to be fraudulent. And in this case, because it was absolutely demonstrated to the public that in fact it was accurate and correct, the people who voted in that election had 98% participation, and very few were nullified of the votes. And the reason for that was their children talked to them about what they knew, and they saw the evidence in advance, not afterwards, but in advance, that their voting was going to be fair and free. That was a huge accomplishment, in my opinion, because it makes us realize that that's what not only is the education needed. I'm sorry, I'm over at my time, I think. But in any case, it's very important to democracy what we have done, and all international agencies should understand the importance of the work in the democratic process. And I want to thank INE as well. You have to be commended for your openness and for promoting the discussion about the challenges that are faced by democracies, particularly when it comes to elections. So thank you very much. I don't want to overstay my welcome here.
Not at all. And as we've got 10 minutes or 10 minutes left, I want to we've got some questions from the floor, which I will put to you. And also, I just want to quickly find a few themes that kind of run across. And I think one of the themes that runs through all of yours is that really what's at stake is legitimacy. Each one of you have mentioned it in your own way, and you gave the very specific example of just showing the legitimacy of those machines and so forth. Whereas Jose, Dr. Thompson brought it up as being what is at stake in our electoral democracy kind of writ large in terms of the values. But also Matthias, in the trajectory of from how to vote, simply this is how you do it, to why it matters that democracy is a legitimate option. So in some ways, this legitimacy being at stake, that electoral education is, and that is a much more complex topic to deal with. And so what each of you has also mentioned is new alliances. So, and you spoke about actually using professional groups and so forth as observers. That is a way of getting somebody else so this legitimacy, having new allies. Matthias spoke about singers or perhaps actors from Nigeria's Nollywood. That kind of other person who helps with the legitimacy. So those are some of the themes that kind of run through all of you. And my question, or the question from the audience, is about cooperation. Is like, what does cooperation look like on the ground on electoral matters to face these different challenges? And I can just say, for example, on social media, which many of you have mentioned, what cooperating with who and how and with what mechanisms. So I'll put that out there. And also I'll put out that in the Summit for Democracy coming up, there's the opportunity to influence. NDIC is here, and they are the chairs of the cohort, which will prepare model recommendations. And what recommendations are we recommending for countries to protect their own electoral democracy? Those are two very big questions, but cooperation and protecting your democracy. Just a minute or two, and we can perhaps go in the same order as we came in first. So Dr. Thompson, Jose, you are first. So cooperation and
sobre cooperación.
Bien, bueno, gracias.
Well, thank you very much. A question, I could spend a whole panel talking about it, but I have to say the topic is not just to create alliances, but alliances and cooperation strategies that must be at a domestic and international level. Here we need to support each other within us who consider ourselves really democratic bodies that support democracy, and detect those that do not do so. Social media, for example, they are a problem because of false and fake news. But it's an opportunity too, a huge opportunity to convey opportunity to the voters and to involve the youth in a different manner in a process where they will see how electoral events are carried out. When we need citizens mobilization, they're really important. They have an important result for democracy too, that we shouldn't leave at one side. And also, second, I would like to talk about what Matthias mentioned, because democracy too, I have to say, has the characteristic that we have had democracy, but with exclusion of important sectors of our population, starting with the underrepresentation of women, and also many groups that do not identify themselves with the system. And education should be a mechanism to foster inclusion. And in that regard, they must be oriented to overcome given exclusions that must be recognized in the first place. And in that regard, last thing I would like to say is the great importance of constructing and exerting democratic leadership, because authoritarian leadership, we already see them, we know about them, we know how they act. But it's quite important to build democratic leaderships that are efficient, strong, that defend our institutionality, that believe in democracy, and at the same time, that is an educational process and a democratic leadership to exert it, without doubt, will convey a message to the whole society. And we cannot fall on the idea that just authoritarian ones are the ones that obtain important things for their societies or for their states. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm seeing that we've just got 3 minutes left. So I'll, Matthias or Anne, or both, I'll let you, Matthias, if you just, and there's more questions, but I think I'll just pass them to you. You'll need to do them in the chats, but I'll just give Matthias and Anne maybe a minute each, and then we'll round off.
So if it's like that, I will just start with the last question about what are the suggestions to make to the summit that is coming. For me, maybe I will surprise you by saying that if there is one thing, it is for all democracies and established democracies to cure the system. Because when democracy is weak in the US, democracy is facing challenges in France, in UK, it weakens our position in countries like ours, where we are fighting to have people to accept that we can implement democracy. So making sure that democracy works in the US and the established democracy will help us a lot. Now, when you talk about cooperation, for instance, I will just give one example. It depends on the problem that you are facing and what you want to deal with. For instance, if I want to deal with apathy, voter apathy, for instance, I go to artists because these people are able to give incentive or to strengthen incentives for people to go and vote. But I can give other examples. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And you can close us out, Anne.
Sorry. I'd like to talk a little bit about cooperation and learning, because I myself have done a lot of election observations throughout Latin America, but spent much time in Mexico and working with INE. And I spend a lot of time telling people in the United States, both on op-eds and other things, about how forward-thinking Mexico is, how much they've done for their democracy that's really important, that is in contravention to some of the things that we've done or not done. So I think that it's really important for us to learn from each other and to understand how to make a difference in our societies, not just from the internal view that, the United States is, the beacon of democracy, but in fact, there are a lot of places around the world that have really important advances that we have not had. And so that is, I think, a really important key for us to all, and why this is so important to have this meeting here today. And I will also say, when I speak to people that I've gone to Latin America in particular, they say, we should have election observations in the United States. And in fact, Transparencia Electoral is coming to near where I live, San Jose, California, and Los Angeles for the midterm election to observe the elections.
Excellent. Thanks, all the wonderful panelists. This was a lovely session. And back to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Teres. Thank you very much. Congratulations for this splendid panel, very rich in ideas and proposal and reflections in an important topic of education for democracy. Vamos a tener un receso.
We're going to have now a 5 minutes break, so we can start with our next topic in regard to Europe and Asia and the main findings in regard to regional fora.
La democracia nos importa a las y los mexicanos.
Porque permite que nuestras voces sean escuchadas.
porque permite que nuestras grandes ideas puedan construir un mejor futuro. Durante mucho tiempo soñamos con democracia, pero hoy que estamos despiertos y unidos, logramos que todas las voces cuenten. Unidas y unidos vivimos en una democracia sin muros que nos dividan. Unidas
luchamos por nuestros derechos.
y unidos hemos conseguido tener elecciones libres y auténticas. Por eso inspiramos al mundo para proteger la democracia, los derechos y nuestras libertades, porque ese es el camino de la paz. México es sede de la Cumbre Global de la Democracia Electoral, porque en el mundo y en México, nuestro INE nos une.
Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes.
Good morning, good evening to the different regions of the American continent. We're going to continue with the last session of this first day of the Global Summit for Electoral Democracy. And at the same time, we're going to talk about the main findings of regional fora in Europe and Asia. Our moderator, Mr. Sion Rin Kim, who works at the Association of World Elections Bodies, a web in regard to political research and international cooperation. He's a member of the publishing work of AWeb. I would like to give the floor to our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Seung Kim. I'm working for the Secretariat of AWeb, the Association of World Election Bodies. I'm very honored and happy to be joining the Global Summit of Electoral Democracy in person here in Mexico. Before starting, I'd like to offer my sincere congratulations to INE Mexico on the successful hosting of this global level event. It has taken a lot of effort for INE Mexico to plan, organize, and bring this ambitious global summit this far. Congratulations again. And in this session, we are going to learn about main findings of the regional forums which took place before this global summit. Without those regional forums, this global summit might not be possible. Those regional forums are the sources of ideas, lessons, and discourses of today's global summit. Particularly in this session, we are going to discuss main findings of the European Regional Forum and Asian Regional Forum. In each forum, they identified the most common challenges facing each region and discussed and sought solutions to the challenges. The European Regional Forum took place on June 8 and 9, addressing the most important issues Europe is facing, such as effectiveness of civic education, threat of populism, freedom of expression, and integrity of electoral legislation. The Asian Regional Forum took place on August 11. This forum was focused on inclusive and accessible elections. The importance of the participation of young people and citizens in remote areas was addressed, as well as accessibility for people with disabilities and senior citizens. We have two distinguished speakers, Mr. Esteban Ahi. He's a representative of the former Association of the European Election Officials. And Mr. Ahi will share with us main findings of the European Regional Forum. And we also have Mr. Dharmendra Sharma, Senior Deputy Election Commissioner of Election Commission of India. Mr. Sharma will speak about main ideas discussed during the Asian Regional Forum. Now we'll begin this session with Mr. Ai. Mr. Ai, you have 7 minutes. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. It is my great honor to participate in this forum, in this conference. It was Mr. Szolnoki, Zsolt Szolnoki, who was expected to speak on this meeting, but unfortunately he had a schedule conflict, that therefore he requested me to read his intervention. Mr. Kim was very kind to introduce the four main topics with which the European Regional Forum dealt in June. And they are the civic education, populism, freedom of expression and digital platforms, the integrity of elections, and the electoral legislation. It was our great honor that more than 100 election practitioners attended the conference. Also, the forum featured 23 high-level speakers and panelists, among them election officials, members of academia, representatives of key stakeholders, such as European Union, the Venice Commission, and ACEE's long-lasting partner, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Now I would go to the main findings of the forum. Of course, it is impossible to sum up such an event. My aim is here to just highlight some of the key findings. One of the key themes was civic education. Citizenship training and civic education are of utmost importance in democratic states. It plays a key role in preserving and promoting democratic values in the broader society. It was highlighted that while the question is researched, political structures, processes, and debates often marginalize young people. Thus, institutional challenges are needed, so youth participation is encouraged. Moreover, it was noted that civic education is more needed than ever, since the global cooperation is and was challenged by events such as the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Key values of the European Union, such as peace, solidarity, and observance of international law, are supported by civic education. Policies implemented within the European Union are key, ranging from the early childhood education to adult education. Finally, the possibilities of democratic renewal through civic education were emphasized. Nevertheless, there is no silver bullet. That is, no single solution for the challenges to which democracies are exposed today. However, civic education is a paramount tool for helping democratic renewal. 3 recommendations were outlined. First, to emphasize exposure to diverse views, followed by learning experience and emphasize civic discourse. Second, to develop informed views and foster skills to critically analyze information. And third, to institutionalize democratic values in schools through a positive youth development approach. The forum also focused on populism, recognizing the social phenomenon on the rise, and it has far-reaching implications regarding democracy and elections. Through the example of Hungary, it was demonstrated that although voting day fraud is not widespread, regard has to be paid to the context of elections. Populist forces do not constrain themselves and change the institutional setting if they can. The importance of party and campaign finance system was underscored as it was thoroughly changed, having major impact on the pluralism of the political competition. Closely related to this, one of the speakers emphasized that international recommendations might be used against their purpose, namely that their selective implementation in illiberal or hybrid regimes might serve partisan interests. Besides institutional challenges, the notion of centrist populism is defined, labeling nationalist, anti-establishment forces that are skeptic of thicker ideologies and constitutionalism and have a distrust towards political parties. This is different from radical populism that attacks outrightly minorities, constitutional bodies, media pluralism, and other core liberal constitutional ideas. It was highlighted that while influential populists rise as centrists, they soon become radical, responding to individual relative deprivation and growing inequalities. Finally, related to populist narratives, it was pointed out that their emergence depends on how the wider publicum perceives the political system. Also, as shown by the example of Poland, populists use false narratives that are extremely capable of bringing together radical voters as well as of shifting the agenda, to which narratives some simplified solutions are provided. These false narratives often question the integrity of elections. The third topic reverted around the theme of integrity of elections and electoral legislation. Elections are exposed to malpractices that threaten the integrity of votes. One of the key notions was trust. It was pointed out that in more developed democracies, the confidence of elections correlated with good governance. In hybrid or authoritarian regime, no such correlation prevailed. This shows that instead of focusing on trust uncritically, regard should be paid to electoral trustworthiness. The European sphere of electoral values was also highlighted. The single most important European soft law document in the field, the Code of Good Practice of Electoral Matters. This guideline embodies the that Europe has some core electoral values, and electoral integrity is among them. Also, electoral malpractices are closely related to electoral integrity. They are the other side of the coin. Regarding the most important trends, it was underscored that since 2020's global electoral integrity increased. Nevertheless, in the recent years, there have been worrying increases in the manipulation of information and electoral violence. Lastly, the forum focused on digital platforms and freedom of expression. There are attempts on the European level to regulate digital platforms. The forum assessed the current regulations and their relationship with democracy in general and elections in particular, with regard to the European traditions and common heritage related to freedom of expression. First of all, there is much progress regarding disinformation and cybersecurity since 2016. Both EMBs as well as EU and domestic legislators take considerable steps. Nevertheless, online political advertising poses significant challenges in terms of enforcement and regulation. Regulative attempts were made to tackle these challenges on EU level in order to ensure transparency and provide guidelines for political parties. Nevertheless, it was emphasized that the EU should strengthen cooperation both internally and externally. Regarding social media, the key challenges are arbitrary moderation on the one hand, algorithmic information management on the other hand, also fake news, and finally, the question of monolithic structures in the field. And there were also two other topics. One is related to European Union parliamentary elections reform, and the other one, which I would also highlight, is the representation of women. Europe is known to have some governments pursuing feminist foreign policy, but the domestic internal implications of feminism remains underdeveloped. The importance of feminism, perspective of civic education, civic empowerment, and combating electoral gender-based violence was highlighted. With this, I would like to end my intervention. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hai. Mr. Hai summarized the findings of European Forum. Several issues, including civic education, radical populism in Europe, and integrity issues in terms of electoral legislation and cybersecurity, fake news. Actually, those are the issues not only for Europe, but worldwide. And he also mentioned about the European Union reform to tackle this issue. And we are going to further discuss this later on. And now, Mr. Sharma, you also have 7 minutes. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, the Election Commission of India hosted the Asian Region Summit on the theme Making Election Inclusive, Accessible and Participative in August of 22, where more than 50 delegates from EMBs and international bodies participated. Honorable Lorenzo Cordovo, Council President of National Electoral Institute of Mexico, gave a recorded message in which he expressed a concern about the threat and the challenges to democratic regimes, especially since the last 10 years, the lack of ability to solve problems such as poverty, inequality, corruption, and violence, which has become a breeding ground for understandable discontent with the government, and expressed that these discussions will yield common trends and action that together all of us can implement to renew the global democratic path. The summations and findings both by the keynote address of the Chief Election Commissioner Rajiv Kumar and the concluding address by Shri Anup Chandra Pandey, our Election Commissioner, made the following key points. The Chief Election Commissioner began by relating the requirement of accessible election as a basic building block of the nation building activity, not only in India, but across the globe. He quoted and recalled Mahatma Gandhi's famous statement that under democracy, even the weakest shall have the same opportunities as the strongest. He then went on to emphasize the role that election officials have to play in monitoring the legal, structural, and practical barriers that obstruct inclusion and the extent to which marginalized sections of society are actively participating in elections as voters, candidates, election officials, and in other roles. He was particularly emphasizing that all EMBs across the world, whatever their legal systems, try their best to involve all citizens in voting, and that they have made and taken significant innovative measures to include all sections of society in the electoral processes. So it's important that we appreciate these initiatives, gain from them, and build a positive discourse about the successes also in the democratic spaces. He then went on to, and as the further discussions followed, that the identification of all manners of marginalized communities, those marginalized by region, geography, literacy, language, ethnicity, economy, gender, disability, among others, is a must, a precondition to ensure their voices are heard and that they're able to express their voting right. That whenever a new technology or process or a SOP is introduced or designed or a service is adopted by an EMB, accessibility should now become part of the design itself and not added later on as an afterthought. That means that must be the new normal, is the point that was made. Now, linked to this, how can that be achieved? Addressing inequities and inclusion requires the data that is collected on all manner of marginalized voters is not contaminated, not biased at source. Outreach can only be possible if we create a database of voters and map the areas which need support. To illustrate the point of the success of such an approach, in India, it was indicated that this has resulted in registering more than 7.7 million persons with disability voters and around 15 million electors above 80 years of age, who were mapped and unable to vote postal ballot. Similar success was in the women voting, where over the 7 decades and 17 national elections later, with very thorough mapping and proper data maintenance, the women participation in 2019 finally exceeded that of men in India. He then went on, and the whole discussion went on from the meeting, that the COVID-19 circumstances provided both a challenge and an opportunity. Various EMBs took extremely innovative measures to include those who were affected by COVID directly and the consequence of COVID, which was creating all kinds of barriers. In India, we implemented the postal ballot system and allowed the voting at home by COVID-infected patients and 80 plus voters and persons with disability. All over the world, the lessons that have been learned by the innovative measures taken by EMB need to be explored and worked upon, including that of remote voting and internet voting, which is resorted to in various across the globe. The second session, the main technical session, the first session, was on enhancing participation of youth, gender, citizens in remote areas. His Excellency Election Commissioner of Mauritius chaired the session, and senior advisor from International IDEA actually did the very good analytical paper and identifying the various categories of inhibitors to equal electoral access and participation, and also segregated those that can be addressed by the EMBs themselves through their procedures and those that require a more fundamental change in the polity itself. EBEB Secretariat, and here our session moderator himself led that particular session, spoke of overview of process where there is a process assurance of participation vis-a-vis the outcome assurance, which includes specific reservation of ratio and seats to be given to those who are denied accessibility to the electoral process at any given point in time, including constituencies oriented candidacy or guarantee of ratio of women candidates. The Philippine representative also gave a similar example and said that part of the mission statement that they have that includes the Commission from Philippines to give incentives to political parties with women agenda and promote the integration of women in their leadership and hierarchy. The last technical session was on enhancing participation of persons with disability and senior citizen, chaired by His Excellency the Chief Election Commissioner of Uzbekistan. Maldives brought out the point that while they have made several measures, but the inhibitions are coming in terms of budget limitation and geographical distribution faced by EMBs like Maldives. The Nepal Election Commission once again made the point about having a specialized institution created in terms of gender and inclusion policy in election management plan of 2021, and that how they are able to go right down geographically as well as across partnership and create partnerships across those bodies and associations who espouse the cause of participation of persons with disadvantage. The IFS delegate from Sri Lanka again made the point about the gap in legal provisions becoming a major source of problem in the in our march towards inclusion and the need for desegregated data. She pointed out the experience in Sri Lanka where with IFS and collaboration, they have created partnerships with 7 national cross-disability organizations and 17 organizations representing various districts and other disabilities. This is the broad conclusion and the summations of discussion that were held. I thank once again, since I've crossed the time, I will close at this stage and thank you all for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. Mr. Sharma talked about necessity for inclusive and accessible elections. And he also mentioned some measures India and some other Asian countries have taken to overcome those challenges. Now we've got some questions, and the first question will go to Mr. Ai. Actually, I've got 2 questions for you. One, which actions are being taken in Europe to fortify cooperation among electoral institutions? And the second question, so the world was shocked by the war. And do you think war comes as a result of the crumbling of democracy? Mr. Ai, please answer.
Thank you very much. I didn't hear clearly the second question, but basically I can speak about cooperation in terms of the ACCCO. Basically, we worked for more than 30 years fostering cooperation between electoral management bodies, and basically ACCCO has great results, or have had great results in cooperation, because in many countries both legislation and best practices changed over the 30 years. Basically, some of our experts and close friends from friends who were leaders of the IFS, Richard Sudriad and Paul de Gregorio, emphasized several times that ACCCO helped to create or to expand the European region to Central Europe, and also in development of best practices in elections in the region. And if you could please repeat the second question, then I would try to react to that.
Okay, the second question about it's about the war. And do you think the war comes as a result of the crumbling of democracy in Europe?
The first word was not quite clear. I apologize.
Okay, the war.
War. Okay, I see. Okay, so
the crumbling of democracy in Europe.
Yeah, basically that would be a political question and not electoral per se. Well, there are conflicting opinions that the war was a result or only the the approach to the current situation. I mean, previous policies resulted the war, or the war will result change in the policies. So unfortunately, I cannot properly answer to that question. But I don't think that that the European democracy will crash because of the war. I believe that there is a huge cooperation going on to support the Ukrainian people, both those who are fighting in Ukraine and also those who are fleeing the war to different Central and Eastern European countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hai, for answering the very difficult question. Okay, the next question goes to Mr. Sharma. Are there any actions taken in Asia to fortify electoral integrity?
Thank you. Yes, there are. This is the Fortify Electoral Integrity is obviously a project in perpetuity. Each challenge has to be answered. Each jurisdiction answers a challenge, because a threat to what constitutes a threat also is changing very rapidly. Many a times we're not even able to understand where a particular process has been compromised. Whenever you understand, most election management bodies, including in India, we take necessary steps to ensure that doesn't reoccur. So there can be several examples, new technologies, new challenges. We have defensive technologies we adopt. We adopt processes which anticipate the possibility of advanced technology or other methods to come in to subvert the electoral integrity whenever we do so. So it's always a project in progress and in perpetuity. So unless there is a very specific question to be asked, I can answer, but that is what it is. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've got one more question for you, Mr. Sharma. So it's about professionalization of EMBs. So are there any efforts in Asia to promote the professionalization of EMBs? Maybe you can use India's case.
Yes. Yes, that is the point that the Chief Election Commissioner made, that of the election officials having to play a very important role, the technical staff, the permanent staff. And I take this opportunity to add that as part of the Summit of Democracy, one of the first conferences that India would be hosting in our cohort on electoral democracy would be the role framework and the capacity building of EMBs, where this very issue would be discussed in detail. That of course there's a wider leadership of the highest management of the election commissioner themselves, who in most cases become political appointments. But then there's the technicals and permanent staff and secretariat, which is being created, and their capacities to read data, to collect data, to point out what is fair and correct is a very valuable framework that they have to sit on. So yes, without doubt, and that is the reason why several EMBs in Asia, as well as other parts of the world, have created institutions of capacity building, permanent in nature, like the India International Institute of Democracy and Election Management. I'm sure that institutions have been built in Mexico and several places, which are both embedded in arm's length and do a 24/7 work round the clock to build capacities in the permanent secretariat and staff, and also enhance capacities of those who get involved in election in an intersectional or episodal manner. Both target groups are being addressed. So, but as I said, that the conference paper and the post paper has already gone out. We will be hosting it on 31st of October and 1st of November. And this very aspect will be discussed in much greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last, the final question for Mr. Sharma. And you mentioned about technology, and you mentioned about technology as one of the solutions to overcome the challenges to realize accessible elections. Could you further elaborate on it?
Yeah, yes, that was a point made by the presenter from IFS representative in Sri Lanka, as well as several other representatives, depending on the degree and the nature of disability. For example, the physical infrastructure at the voting booth has to be made accessible in the sense where technology comes in, whether it's simply braille. If you're hard of hearing, then what kind of a sound instrumentation that comes into being depends on the motor disability. So various technologies are possible, which makes the voter experience at the booth, because the dilemma we are facing is, while we can say that the person with a disability can vote from the comfort of the home, but that's kind of ghettoizing the problem. The Election Commission's initiative or priority would be that we get everybody to come and vote at the booth. And that is where technology comes in terms of data capture, mapping, and ensuring that everybody comes in time and making the booth much more accessible in that sense. There are several other technology and information that take place, which at this stage, probably I'll not be able to narrate much given the time, but that's the basic point I'm making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, this is the end of the session, main findings of regional forums, European Regional Forum and the Asia Regional Forum. So before wrapping up, I would like to thank again Mr. Ai and Mr. Sharma, not only for your today's presentation, but also for having organized the regional forums. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Mañana iniciamos el segundo día.
Thank you very much. Tomorrow we will reconvene for day 2 of our activities. Same time. We will hear about standards and electoral institutions. Thank you very much for your attendance and your participation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma.